Well, the wait is nearly over. The third installment of the Total War Warhammer franchise will soon grace us all with its demonic glory, and let me just say straight away that it is truly glorious. Launching with the highest number of factions yet, combined with a wonderful attention to detail and plenty of quality of life improvements, it is hard not to see myself spend hundreds of hours on this title, like I have with Total War Warhammer 1 and Warhammer 2. But even if you're not a veteran of the series, Total War Warhammer 3 is one to look out for. So, having now spent roughly 60 hours with Total War Warhammer 3, here's my review. To kick things off, like I said, Total War Warhammer 3 has a ton of different factions, 8 to be precise, or 7 if we're not counting the Ogre pre-order DLC race. With 5 of them being demonic factions, one could easily assume them to be quite similar, but that is not at all the case, so let's just start there. Before I continue though, I do need to emphasize that this review is entirely based on the single player portion of the game. Although Total War Warhammer 3 features a number of different multiplayer upgrades, such as simultaneous turns, I have not been in a position to try this extensively as of yet. Alright, so, the factions. For one, we have the embodiment of rage itself in the form of the Khorne faction, which is led by the Bloodthirster, Skarbrand. Khorne is easily the most straightforward way to play the game, namely to destroy everything in your wake, but that doesn't make it any less enjoyable to execute. Creative Assembly has perfectly embodied the notion of aggression with this faction, as Khorne can refill their movement after fighting and razing cities. Now, as with all demonic factions, Khorne has access to something called unholy manifestations, but in Khorne's case, one of them immediately spawns an army for you to fight. Secondly, Khorne lords have access to a movement stance that causes them to take attrition damage from infighting, but increases the rate with which they level up. In combat, they are, as much as you would expect, almost entirely dedicated to glorious melee, while wearing the toughest armor they can find. Their sole leader, Skarbrand, is easily the most terrifying strategy unit I have ever witnessed in action. He is an absolute monster and outshines any monster-type unit Total War has had up until this point, with some of the highest armor, highest melee capabilities, high mass, and abilities that force enemies to rampage around him. He is essentially going to be a raid boss no matter who you put him up against. Bringing it back to the campaign level, Khorne, like all Chaos factions except Slaanesh, will immediately go to war with any non-Chaos faction they encounter. A last point of note is that Khorne has a chance to automatically create settlements from ruins in your provinces. So as Khorne, you can happily continue your murderous rampage and not worry about such silly things such as sending armies to settle a province, and means you are hardly ever punished for razing a city. Suffice to say, no other faction has personified the Total War title quite as well as the Khorne faction does. It sounds simple, but it's very pleasing to execute, as Khorne allows for a lot of small micro decisions on a campaign skill to really optimize your pathing and wanton destruction, and Khorne was easily one of my highlights as a result. Moving on to the father of disease, Nurgle. Now, Nurgle in contrast is a very different faction that will be much harder to initially wrap your head around if you are familiar with Total War. And, by the way, if you aren't, I want to point out that Creative Assembly has put a lot of effort into improving the onboarding for newer players. In fact, there's a separate prologue that takes a few hours and sees you fight through a custom mini-campaign that is well worth playing if just for the story and dialogue aspects. Truly, there are numerous tiny UI clarifications and visualizations that make this, I would assume, by far the easiest of the three to get into. Okay, back to Nurgle. So the reason they're a little weird is because their entire economy and building system relies on cycles. As Nurgle is the god of, well, mainly death, but also life and rebirth, they incorporated that concept into Nurgle's buildings. Everything you build will go through a few different stages, and this cycle will continue in perpetuity. At the beginning, buildings are very underwhelming and output very little, while near the end of the cycle the buildings are fantastic, and as such it is a way to get very strong units quickly. Secondly, the God of Disease, of course, features plagues. There's a lot more to the plague system with Nurgle than we have seen from the Skaven in Total War Warhammer 2, because during the campaign you will, from start to finish, be focused to some extent on brewing new plagues, such as through research, and can spread these by infecting your own buildings or armies. Pleasingly, these plagues have a good synergy between the campaign and battle modes of Total War. Plagues are an effective way to soften up your opponents prior to assaulting them. From a combat perspective, like Khorne, they are almost entirely based on melee, but unlike Khorne, every unit that Nurgle has is incredibly slow. Slow and tanky. They are entirely focused on an attrition-based hammer and anvil playstyle. Kugath Plaguefather, the sole legendary lord available as of now, is interestingly enough an artillery piece, but his main strengths lie in his spellcasting potential. All in all, expect for enemies to try and successfully kite you, and for you to take it slowly and hardly care. Certainly a faction for the patient. In contrast to the slow attrition then is Slaanesh. Slaanesh's sole legendary lord is Nakari, and the entire Slaanesh roster is focused around quick maneuvering. Once more, like their other demonic brethren, they prefer to get close up in melee and actually feature no ranged units whatsoever. In general, their units have very high melee defense, allowing them to bob and weave while dealing high, usually armor-piercing damage. They also have access to a very solid form of magic, the Lore of Slaanesh, which further enhances their potential to fight in melee, to deal damage, and to beguile their enemies. Like with the previous two, expect a hammer and anvil type of playstyle, but despite the melee similarities, their immense speed contrasts them nicely from their competitors. On the campaign map, Slaanesh stands out from the other Chaos Gods by being the sole Chaos faction that can interact positively, if we can call it that, with non-Chaos factions. Slaanesh has a massive focus on fostering cults among enemies, which is done through a few different systems, but primarily through cultists. The resource linked to this system is crucial to succeeding on the campaign map and allows you to buff your own provinces, spawn entirely new armies with no gold upkeep, or even forcibly vassalize non-playable factions. Despite issues that I'll get to in a moment, I'll say that my full, very hard difficulty Slaanesh playthrough was easily one of the most enjoyable playthroughs I've done with a Total War Warhammer game as of yet. Slaanesh also gets a Seduce Units option prior to every combat encounter, which can nicely swing a fight into your favor, or even allows you to utilize fights you knew you were going to lose to water down an enemy's army by having them effectively kill off their own units. Now last, and I will unfortunately say least, is Tzeentch, the god of change. Yet for a god about change, he feels surprisingly old. Tzeentch is the only one out of the four that focuses almost entirely on ranged units. This is effectively a buff, as ranged units do definitely still reign supreme on the harder difficulties. That said, Tzeentch doesn't have a lot of choices here, especially in the early game. Whereas all monogod factions are a little lackluster in the amount of units at their disposal, this feels extra painful for Tzeentch, who also gets even fewer than his competitors, with entire building tiers feeling rather empty. Mechanically, his units are very strong. Again, they are mostly ranged, so they have an edge here, and Tzeentch has some amazing spellcasting potential, as you would expect. More notably though, is that all Tzeentch units have a rechargeable health pool called Barrier. Barriers are extremely powerful, especially when you consider that they can almost trivialize some of the most powerful late game spells, as they can absorb the damage, back off, and recharge. Unfortunately, this mechanic, despite being so ridiculously strong, doesn't feel particularly exciting to play around with, and managing barrier bars is a little dull. This is especially an issue in the early game, where your armies look more like a sea of pink and blue blobs. Your army will be especially weak in melee, and is rather slow at this stage, requiring you to utilize the barriers to the best of your ability by rotating out your weak frontline units. As Total War has never been particularly good at having you manually retreat with your units, as entities can get stuck on enemy entities, this becomes a particular point of tedium with Tzeentch in the early stages of your campaign. Once you do make it to endgame though, where most of your units can fly and effectively guide around, this barrier becomes laughably powerful. Furthermore, they rely far too much on reshaped units that we have seen in previous installments, such as the Forsaken and the Chaos Spawn, neither of which have ever been particularly interesting or powerful. So what is already a diminished roster turns out to be one that feels surprisingly old and flat. This is of course not exclusively an issue for Tzeentch, but as they are the only type of variety Tzeentch has in his early game roster, and also the only effective, arguably effective, frontline units, they become more of a prevalent issue than what I found to be more of an afterthought with any of the other Chaos Gods. On the bright side, outside of combat, Tzeentch has a lovely set of gimmicks that really allows you to mess with the campaign map. Giving settlements to yourself is obviously very powerful, but you can also use this to appropriately spread chaos. Adding onto this, you can start rebellions, or just stop a faction from moving anything for a turn. A faction that certainly will live its best chaotic life in a multiplayer setting. Really annoy your friends. Now that we've talked about all four single Chaos Gods, let's talk about the fifth Chaos faction in Total War Warhammer 3, which is called the Legion of Chaos, led by your own custom Demon Prince. I've said the word unique far too many times now, but this one is truly unique, offering an incredible breadth of different customization options through unlockable items that change your prince's appearance and functionality. It's quite a cleverly designed faction, as they are surprisingly easy to play, despite technically having access to every single demonic unit in the game. Essentially, Creative Assembly has focused on one system here, and the whole faction really drives it home. They don't have any research, and they don't inherently have a lot of different mechanics to juggle, they just have one really important and advanced one, namely demonic glory. Now this is a very busy screen with a lot of icons, but the system is very, very simple. Every time you create a settlement, every time you finish a quest, every time you defeat an army, you dedicate to one of the 4 Chaos Gods, or try and stay in the Chaos Undivided area. Once you hit a certain threshold of demonic glory respective to a particular Chaos God, you unlock a new piece of gear or system. That's it. And it allows for a ton of different ways to approach the game. It is also tied into the Demon Princess skill tree, and because you actively decide which Chaos God a settlement is dedicated to, it's easy to see and understand where your units are coming from. Something worth pointing out here, it's also the only way to play Nurgle with a regular Total War building system. Now most of these unlocks are different gear pieces, ranging from entirely different heads to tails and weapons, but every so often you reach a threshold that unlocks essentially a watered down mechanic of one of the other 4 Chaos Gods. For instance, if you go the Tzeentch route, you get teleporting as a stance, or if you pick Slaanesh, you get their Seduce Units feature. You're not ever going to get to the point where those mechanics are nearly as advanced or effective as they would be on their own respective factions, and you don't get any of the research benefits which are tied to it, but nevertheless they allow the Legion of Chaos to create some incredibly potent and very interesting combinations. Honestly, the only downside with this faction is its starting location, and this yet again brings back issues that Total War historically has had. Norska, the location the Legion of Chaos starts in, has always been a tedious location in the previous 2 games due to the lackluster options to stop enemy forces encroaching on you through naval routes. This hasn't changed. On the other side of the sea are a lot of angry humans, Empire and Kislevites that will always be at war with you and will gladly give up all their possessions just for a chance to take a boat trip to Norska. I then really wish Creative Assembly had figured out an option to make naval chase sequences, so to say, less of a tedious whack-a-mole game, as unfortunately the Legion of Chaos ends up spending a fair amount of time doing just that. Now, if you weren't feeling like becoming one of the damned, there's 3 other remaining factions available to you: Kislev, Grand Cathay, and the Ogre Kingdoms. Unlike the Chaos factions, however, all of these feature at least 2 legendary lords on launch, with an unlockable 3rd option for Kislev. Kislev then is a jack-of-all-trades type of faction. Almost all their units, be they ranged or melee, are decent in both ranged and melee. Most of their melee units have some ranged ammo, and most of their ranged units do fine when up close. This is really based on the concept of their harsh northern survival lifestyle, and credit where credit's due, they stand out a lot from previous human factions such as the Empire in that their units simply will not break quickly. Their artillery units can't really be killed easily, and virtually all their infantry have great leadership. The end result being that Kislev is a faction with a lot of tactical options during combat that is surprisingly forgiving to mistakes, as none of your units will ever really be in any big danger, as you might expect seeing how most of them are protected by bears. On the campaign map, you have the option of playing as the Frost Queen of Kislev or the leader of the Orthodoxy, and the initial stages of their campaign are very much about this internal struggle of who gets to carry the torch. Reminiscent of the Empire, they have specific mechanics in place that will almost certainly lead to consolidation of one of the 2 factions. The oddity here, however, is that in a game where Creative Assembly has succeeded so much in pairing theme with mechanics, Kostaltin gets left behind in the snow. He supposedly is extremely suspicious of the Ice Court, which in-game is a mechanic that gives you more control over the strengths of your wizards, but nevertheless he engages in this system identically as the Frost Queen. So although narratively they keep reinforcing that he wishes to undermine and overtake the Ice Court, mechanically he unfortunately doesn't stand out a lot in this role and has fewer defining aspects to him. All in all, Kislev is an enjoyable and well-rounded faction, but where supposedly there's meant to be a distinction in the type of units that they have, they all feel rather similar on a thematic point. On the other side of the map, we then have Grand Cathay, the heavily Eastern-inspired traders and innovators led by the Dragon Emperor and Empress and their children. Their main mechanic, both in combat and on the campaign map, is the concept of balance, yin and yang. Essentially, a unit will either be a yin unit or a yang unit, and as long as you have one of each type near one another, they will get significant combat buffs. Likewise, on the campaign map, structures will often be either yin or yang structures, and you're heavily incentivized to keep this in perfect balance. Frankly, I've always been a big fan of keeping doom stacks under control through racial mechanics, and this is one of those that naturally has you seek out more interesting army combinations. Likewise, you'll be giving your campaign structures some more thought than usual. This is also not at all an annoying mechanic to work with, as there's plenty of options to restore your balance, and you'll have frequent event pop-ups to shake this up as well. Speaking of, if you're a big fan of event choices, Grand Cathay will also do excellently, as they have a trade caravan system that is essentially picking a path, and at almost every stage you'll be prompted with the small decision event, which ultimately results in a large reward if your caravan successfully arrived. It is a faction that certainly has plenty of campaign mechanics to juggle at any given point, and they manage to make them all fun to engage in. Well, possibly, with the exception of the Bastions, though this is mainly due to an exploit that has never been solved. Cathay is protected by the so-called Grand Bastion, and this is a set of individual bastion points alongside a wall that cuts them off from the Chaos Wasteland. As Cathay, though this is less of a relevant point if you play as Zhao Ming and just let your sister do what she pleases, you are occasionally prompted to defend your walls. This is all fine on paper, but one carryover issue from the older game trivializes this system. Funny enough, this may actually be more of an issue as Tzeentch. Namely, Tzeentch is located very close to this wall, and the, I presume, intended experience is for Tzeentch players to find a way to properly siege the wall or go around it. However, as a result of one of the older Total War mechanics, a structure that is being actively sieged by one army no longer emits a zone of control, allowing everyone else to pass. A very unfortunate exploit that Creative Assembly did not fix as of yet, and trivializes a part of the Tzeentch campaign. The AI can and might also do this, so it certainly feels like an exploit that needs to be fixed to prevent long-term irritation as Cathay. Now, finally, before I move on to general mechanics, we have the Ogre Kingdoms, and this is a pre-order DLC faction, so I'll be brief. They absolutely feel like a fleshed out faction. No Warhammer 1 Chaos Warriors issue here. In combat, their units are tough and almost all count as large units, which makes them a joy to watch as they run across groups of infantry, until they run into a spear wall, that is. They can also all siege walls, so siege battles allow for a lot of entry points. On the campaign map, they have what might as well be a unique mechanic now. Much like Slaanesh, they can effectively negotiate with both Chaos and non-Chaos factions. They have two main concepts to keep in mind, namely, all their armies need meat. And their regular settlements cannot go above tier 3, but they have the option of creating camps anywhere they want, which ends up being their high tier settlements instead. All this combined pleasantly gives them a good sense of freedom of where to go, who to fight, and what area to fortify. To summarize, with Total War Warhammer 3, Creative Assembly has created the best and most varied set of factions on launch as of yet. They have also managed to perfectly capture the thematic and conceptual elements of these factions and translated them into a set of interesting, engaging, and extremely varied strategy mechanics for each of the factions that allow for fun decisions on all difficulty levels and great optimization on the harder ones. Yes, demonic factions, especially Tzeentch, are a little on the small side when it comes to rosters, but nevertheless the quality of their systems and individual units makes up for that small downside in spades. Now, regardless of which faction you pick, everyone has the option to either win through complete annihilation of their opponents, or to follow the story path and unique mechanics called the Realm of Chaos. Every faction has their own motivation for participating in this global race, which is portrayed through some wonderful cinematics, which rival if not improve upon the type of cinematics we've seen in Total War Warhammer 2. Adding onto this, the actual Realms of Chaos are gorgeous to behold. Both the campaign map aspects and the battle maps are very creative and very impressive. As this is the closest the game will get to what I'd consider a spoiler, I'll refrain from showing much here and simply give you a little glimpse, as any good Slaaneshi player would. Mechanically, however, the realms are honestly mostly a way to extend and bloat the game's total playtime. Essentially, they trigger at set intervals and require you to send your faction leader off to a different area where they will spend a significant amount of turns wrestling with the realm-specific mechanics. There certainly is a huge aspect of it being, in general, far too slow. That said, there are some interesting aspects here, and again, from a visual perspective, they're wonderful the first time around. Within these realms, you will usually get attacked by various demon armies of their respective realms, and although fights are generally faster in these realms, it nevertheless becomes tedious. In all cases, this accumulates in a final wave-based fight where you're given the tools to build structures, upgrade units, and call in reinforcements. These fights, again, are just too lengthy, and seeing as it's also very difficult to lose, it doesn't feel overly satisfying despite the wonderful aesthetics. On a campaign map scale, your leader is stuck in either one of the 4 gods' realms, and depending on the Chaos God, you essentially have a small race with any of the other faction leaders, as only one of you can get the reward per realm during these moments. It results in an almost puzzle-like situation where you need to optimize your pathing as best as you can, as quickly as you can. In general, I didn't particularly mind any of these, with the exception of, and although I'm starting to sound like a broken record here, Tzeentch. The Tzeentch realm feels particularly tedious, as this has you figure out the right paths through teleportation nodes that immediately eat up the rest of your movement. And it gets you in situations where it starts to feel unfair, as other faction leaders might just randomly have picked the right teleport platform. I'd heavily suggest you do this one last, since there will be fewer factions that still need to do the Tzeentch part at that stage. Now again, Annihilation is of course a suitable alternative option, and I suspect it will be significantly quicker if you utilize some of the boons you can get from the Chaos Realms. In particular, both the Slaaneshi and Khorne realms grant some very interesting boons that you can use in the regular map portions. On further playthroughs, it's likely that you'll have more fun engaging only in these realms when you think it's beneficial to your normal campaign progress and winning through a regular annihilation style. Additionally, as these portals to the realms spawn at set intervals and there is plenty of warning ahead of time, it's quite easy to prepare and set up for any potential realm excursions. Adding on to this, the portal locations are also the same every single time, so in that sense, Creative Assembly has certainly created a campaign mechanic that can be cleverly played into much more than they have in the past. And as such, I found it in general to be enjoyable from a narrative and atmospheric perspective the first time around, and treated it as a way to get potential treasures every time thereafter. It's certainly far from perfect, and if your goal is to see all the cinematics and story aspects, it's certainly rather tedious, as the mechanics in the realms themselves lose any aspect of intrigue once you've done them once. Adding on to this, although entering the realms of Khorne and Slaanesh can be extremely beneficial, it is much easier to ignore the realms altogether, as this prevents the rifts from scaling in difficulty, leaving you far safer for the remainder of the game, albeit perhaps not as strong. Even more counterintuitively, this system does disincentivize territorial expansion. The campaign is easier if you keep your empire small so you can easily squash the rifts when they do appear. From a narrative perspective, there's also the oddity of being gifted a very specific reward once you're done with the 4 rifts, because this reward does not thematically fit all factions in the slightest. Though to be clear, this is a complaint regarding the absolute end of endgames that is technically past your victory point and should probably be considered more of an amusing boon. No, in general, I would say this mechanic is significantly more interesting than the campaign mechanics introduced in past titles. It has some tantalizing buffs and the option to teleport around can be interesting, but I suspect it'll mostly be an afterthought once you've engaged with it once or twice, and I've found little reason to my own benefit to explore this system to any significant extent past the first time. Luckily, I really enjoyed the actual campaign map thus far, so depending on how the combined Immortal Empires map shakes up, this will either be a watered down version of that, as we've seen with Total War Warhammer 2, or just be a way to play a more condensed version. But it's one that comes with a less frustrating and inherently tight campaign mechanic than some of the older Total War Warhammer 2 factions still suffer from. Aside from these obvious and big additions to the game, there's a lot to talk about when it comes to smaller and more subtle changes. For one, diplomacy has much improved. Although there are still annoyances, for instance, Slaanesh plays into vassals a lot, but allies can and sometimes will still attack your vassals, which is rather baffling. However, because there's so many other good reasons to engage in diplomacy on a more interesting level for everyone, including Slaanesh now, I found it to still be a massive net positive and a system I enjoyed engaging in much more than before. Simple UI and quality of life changes do a lot of the heavy lifting here. Total War Warhammer now features a quick deal option, which certainly makes it much quicker. And if you're playing any faction inclined to use diplomacy, this will become one of your favorite buttons. Adding on to this, Creative Assembly has greatly clarified why factions will or won't agree to your terms, and it's also much easier to see who they will be angry with. If you do end up allying with any faction, there's a lot of additional improvements here now as well. For one, you can actually see if an AI is intent on attacking a certain enemy, but even if they decide to do hardly anything the rest of the game, it now has an outpost feature, which allows you to recruit units from their faction. Very useful, for instance, when you play a Chaos faction and would like to supplement your melee armies with a few ranged skirmishers. Another important improvement to note is that you now finally have the option of properly threatening an enemy raiding force to leave. If they don't agree to this, you can attack them without being punished. Regarding being attacked, united against you events will happen a lot less often now, as they indicate your threat level on the diplomacy screen, and enemy factions will generally only unite against you if you become a massive threat to them. Finally, you can now trade settlements with allies, so if one of them took something that you believe should be yours, you can probably get around to fixing that issue now. Thus, in this sense, diplomacy feels a lot less punishing as it did before. Cleverly, with Total War Warhammer 3, it feels as if Creative Assembly has played a lot more into the strengths of their game this time around. As naturally most Chaos factions are inherently hostile to non-Chaos, it becomes a more limited ecosystem, and one in which it is easier to reliably achieve something in general. Norskins and Warriors of Chaos will probably be a fan of you if you're Chaos. Meanwhile, since the non-Chaos factions have plenty of enemies to go around, they're more likely to be kind to you if you're not one of those. The result being that I found enemies and allies to be a lot more logical and less random, despite there not being any overly obvious AI improvements in this department. It is significantly more pleasant to use due to the quality of life improvements, and it's much easier to get a read on the situation. Now, we can't talk about Chaos and not mention corruption. So, corruption in the past was almost entirely a negative system, in the sense that it just affects factions not part of your corruption type. On harder difficulties against AI, this was usually incredibly ineffective since they got plenty of inherent bonuses to public order and regeneration. The result being, it was nearly irrelevant at best and annoying as the player in the worst scenarios. Corruption has seen significant improvement with the introduction of the 4 Chaos Gods. There is now undivided corruption, corruption per each of the 4 Chaos Gods, and the corruption relevant to Undead and Skaven. Crucially, corruption now benefits the player in significant ways. If you're Slaanesh, you'll want to keep Slaaneshi corruption high wherever you go, as this inherently makes your cities do better, but also because the armies you can spawn will lose health in any zone that isn't full of Slaaneshi corruption. Similarly, Nurgle gets significant growth bonuses from his corruption. If your corruption spreads far and wide enough, all demonic factions unlock more powerful, unholy manifestations. Additionally, there is a chance that cults will spawn in corrupted areas, not just for Slaanesh. This gives you access to an Undercity type mechanic for either simple but effective buffs, or more vision and control over the map. In general, the cult mechanics synergize very well with the demonic factions and emphasize further how important corruption is this time around. Essentially, Creative Assembly has packed a bunch of systems on top of this corruption mechanic, which elevates it from being an afterthought into one that's intriguing to utilize as a chaos-based faction. Not to mention, because there's now numerous types of corruption, the environments become aesthetically a lot more pleasing to look at as well. Moving on to another small improvement is the general changes to items for your lords and heroes. It is now possible to fuse items of the same rarity, and you can also disassemble them for gold. A small but solid addition because this turns what was just a fire and forget kind of system into one you want to think about more clearly from start to finish. Moving on to a much more significant change, settlements and sieges. When you assault a settlement in Warhammer 3, you will no longer meet on the open plains, but rather actually attack the settlement. This results in fighting on a map with plenty of choke points and defendable positions. The major improvement this brings is that settlement maps have a ton of variety, and once more Creative Assembly has attached the map layouts very well to the mechanical and thematic aspects of their respective factions. For instance, Empire maps will likely give natural advantages to defending Empire forces with a lot of elevation to utilize their superior range firepower. Likewise, Cathay can also set up their armies easily while firing down our enemies. Meanwhile, Ogre camps have bigger lanes to run across and get their melee boys in proper position. The end result of this is that settlements and siege maps will have more variety depending on the type of enemy you will face, unlike before. They are now also more closely tied into the campaign mechanics. Every siege and settlement map has multiple capture points that can give you resources with which you can construct barricades and towers. This resource can also be improved through campaign structures and buffs, thus allowing you to create locations where you will more easily be able to defend. This also usually forces an attacking army to spread out their units to a more significant extent. If they capture a control point, any structure placed there will be destroyed, and the steady stream of building resources for the defender will be reduced. By and large, this system is a massive improvement over what we have had before, but there are two critical issues. For one, the diminished roster of the demonic factions plays a part in the first negative aspect. Because many of these sieges and settlements can be so heavily based on choke points, it turns out that not all factions have quite as many tactical options to deal with this reoccurring scenario. As these are heavily specialized factions, these fights can end up being a little too repetitive on their end. A much more significant downside of this system is that the AI simply does not handle this multipath dynamic map system very well. Because maps are now significantly more varied and feature a ton of different lanes to push your units through, the AI can get confused easily and can often become ineffective, let alone when you throw dynamic barriers into the mix. When they are attacking, they frequently don't engage in this control point system all that well. For instance, they can easily get stuck in their pathing. But luckily, this problem is diminished when they are defending, which, considering you're usually the aggressor in this game, is fortunately what they'll mostly be doing. It's a system that is certainly an improvement on what we have seen before, especially when you know how easy it was to cheese siege fights in the previous titles, which is going to happen a lot less frequently now. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's still some hilariously simple ways to exploit the AI here. For instance, if you have a fast army, you can often just opt to put all your units in one location during deployment, so the AI will respond by putting all their active towers around that area. And then you just start running somewhere else, often completely splitting the AI's forces up and making their defensive structures far less effective. But the simple fact that this increases the type of fights you'll have makes this an improvement I will happily take. Yes, certainly, I hope Creative Assembly will find ways to mitigate the clear issues the AI has in this department in due time, but I genuinely enjoyed the siege experience in Warhammer 3 a lot more than I have in Warhammer 2. So with all of this being said, there's numerous small things to list that were added or subtly changed with additional quality of life changes. For instance, the simple fact that you can now see which units are idle in a fight is lovely, but it's simply far too much to all mention at once. Is Total War Warhammer 3 perfect? No, far from it. There's still a lot of annoyances and issues that carried over from older games. For instance, although I genuinely love playing as Slaanesh and they're definitely one of my favorites now, it's immensely annoying to see N'Kari or any other large entity unit endlessly chase retreating enemies, but being unable to properly start their attack animation. Which is made significantly more frustrating for Slaanesh in particular, as they actually benefit from killing retreating enemies. Additionally, I've mentioned that Warhammer 3 features some excellent quality of life and UI improvements, and that is absolutely the case, but it highlights several interface issues even more strongly. This game is sometimes rather inconsistent with where it places certain UI elements, such as the quest menu, and this is not an isolated case. It is entirely possible that given another 100 hours with this title, those aspects would stand out as more obnoxious issues, but at this stage, I'll happily spend those 100 hours with glee. Total War Warhammer 3 is absolutely everything I wanted out of this sequel, and more. The absolute care and attention to detail that has obviously gone into this. For instance, there's now audio cues specific to units if you disband them. Such a small thing that you'll hardly ever hear, and yet they added it. There's so much to it. The Warhammer 3 factions are, by and large, absolutely at the top of my favorites now, and although I can say it gets a 9 for having all of these annoyances, and because, frankly, the unique campaign mechanic isn't overly interesting, but still better than Warhammer 2's, I got to be entirely honest with myself here and realize that I will probably, undoubtedly, spend hundreds of hours on this title and enjoy the vast majority of it. As I've already, pound for pound, enjoyed my time with this one more than I have with either of the previous two. If you are a fan of the previous two, this one is without a doubt a massive, enjoyable title. If you're new and were on the fence, rest assured that this is definitely the best entry point, as it's the most accessible and has the most general quality to it. If this is to be the final entry into the Total War Warhammer series, I can wholeheartedly say that Creative Assembly has done an incredible job. It breathes new life into systems and showcases the strengths of what is a rather unique type of game far more than it did with its predecessors. The game series has come a very long way since Warhammer 1. I would say without question that this is Creative Assembly's best game made to date. So that all said, Total War Warhammer 3 gets a 10 out of 10. Now, talking about scoring this title is a little odd because I've been poking so many holes into this title, yet I so overwhelmingly love it for what it does. The annoyances never stack up to be anything major for me, well, except the Tzeentchian Realm of Chaos perhaps. The massive amount of general quality updates, like being able to do instant rematches without having to first concede, reload and restart, the beautiful visual updates that I haven't even mentioned because honestly the map is gorgeous, or the increased variety of fights you'll have, and yes, some of these, such as the survival battles, are far too long and far too slow, though notably you can auto-resolve these as well. The significant and massive diplomacy upgrades, well, I could honestly rant about this game for another 30 minutes, and that is the beauty and issue with reviewing a game like this. If I'm giving it a score, I'm giving it a 10, with the knowledge that it's the most fun I've had with a new title in quite some time now, and can easily see myself playing this in a few years from now. But that's not to say there aren't glaring issues I hope Creative Assembly will mitigate in the months to come. Thank you for watching, my name has been Haas, and I'll see you in the next video.
Move with grace. Drag the